The merciless Colorado winter of 1876 showed no compassion to anyone, least of all to Margaret Sullivan and her 3 young children. Trapped in their isolated homestead as a catastrophic blizzard raged outside, their food nearly gone, and the firewood dwindling, Margaret prepared to face the unthinkable, watching her children join their father in death's cold embrace. But fate, it seemed, had other designs. As the howling wind threatened to become their funeral dirge, an unexpected salvation emerged from the swirling white chaos. Swift Arrow, war chief of the southern Comanche. Their extraordinary encounter would challenge everything Margaret believed about her world and forge a connection that defied the violent prejudices of their time. This is the forgotten tale of how a broken family and a warrior from opposite sides of the American frontier discovered humanity in each other when all hope seemed lost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Sullivan clutched her husband's battered pocket Bible, the leather worn smooth from years of handling, as she stared out at the relentless curtain of snow that had imprisoned her family for 6 days. In the dim light of their cabin, her 3 children, William, aged 10, Emma, 8, and little James, barely 5, huddled together under a threadbare quilt near the dying embers in the fireplace. 8 months earlier, Daniel Sullivan had brought his family to this remote stretch of the Colorado Territory with promises of fertile land and a fresh start. Now he lay in a snow-covered grave behind their cabin, and Margaret was alone with 3 hungry children and dwindling hope. The spring of 1876 had begun with such promise. Their modest homestead had started to take shape, 20 acres cleared. For planting, a sturdy cabin built with Daniel's skilled hands, even a small barn for their mule and 2 milk cows. At 34, Margaret had finally begun to believe that perhaps their gamble of leaving Cincinnati for the frontier might yield the future Daniel had envisioned for them. Daniel's skill as a blacksmith had quickly become valued among the scattered community of settlers, while Margaret's knowledge of herbal remedies and midwifery had made her a welcome addition to their remote corner of the territory. William had taken to frontier life with enthusiasm, proudly helping his father with chores. Beyond his years, Emma had developed a talent for coaxing surprising yields from their small kitchen garden, and even little James had found his place, his natural affinity with animals, making him responsible for the chickens that provided precious eggs. But 3 weeks ago, while Daniel was delivering a repaired plow to the Kennedy homestead 12 miles away, catastrophe had struck with cruel swiftness. Margaret had been teaching Emma how to make soap when William burst through the door, his face white. With terror, "Riders coming, Ma! 4 men, they don't look friendly!" Margaret's heart had lurched. She'd gathered her children close, hoping against hope that the approaching horsemen were simply travelers seeking directions, or perhaps news from the nearest town. Instead, she'd seen 4 men with cold eyes and weather-beaten faces that spoke of years spent living by their own brutal code. Not soldiers, not traders, just men who took what they wanted. "Well now, what do we have here?" the leader had called out, dismounting with fluid grace that belied the danger in his stance. "Looks like we found ourselves a homesteader's wife and some young'uns all on their own." What followed was a nightmare that still haunted Margaret's dreams. They'd ransacked the cabin, taking their winter stores, Daniel's carefully crafted tools, and the small lockbox where they kept what little money they had saved. When Margaret had tried to stop one man from taking the children's winter coats, the leader had struck her with such force that she'd crashed against the wall, her shoulder dislocated from its socket. "Please," she'd gasped through the pain. "Take what you want. Just leave us enough to survive the winter." The leader had laughed then, a sound so devoid of humanity that Margaret had instinctively pushed her children behind her despite her injury. Survive? He'd mocked. Lady, this land takes everything eventually. We're just speeding things along. They'd left the family huddled together on the floor of the cabin Daniel had built with such hope, riding off with nearly everything they needed to make it through the approaching winter. By some miracle, they hadn't found the small pouch of seed pearls Margaret's grandmother had given her as a wedding gift, carefully hidden in a hollow space beneath the floorboards under her bed. Small comfort that would be if they starved or froze to death. For 2 days following the attack, Margaret had pressed on through the pain of her injury, trying to salvage what she could. William had been her rock, taking on responsibilities no child should bear, while Emma had dried her tears to care for her younger brother. Together, they had assessed their situation with grim resolve. Enough food for perhaps 2 weeks, if strictly rationed, enough firewood for slightly longer. Daniel was expected back within days. He would know what to do. But on the 3rd day, the first snow had fallen, unusually early and unexpectedly heavy. By evening, it had become clear this was no ordinary early storm, but the beginning of what old-timers called a white death, a blizzard of exceptional ferocity. When Daniel hadn't returned by the 5th day, Margaret had known with devastating certainty that something was terribly wrong. He would never willingly leave them alone in such conditions unless prevented by catastrophe. On the 6th day, as the storm briefly abated, Jack Kennedy had appeared at their door, his face bearing news worse than any words could convey. Daniel Sullivan had left the Kennedy homestead on schedule, determined to return to his family before the weather worsened. His body had been found halfway home, his wagon overturned in a ravine, his neck broken in the fall. Kennedy and his sons had buried Daniel on a ridge overlooking the valley, marking the grave with a wooden cross until spring would allow for a proper headstone. They'd brought what supplies they could spare: a sack of cornmeal, some dried apples, a bundle of kindling. But with the storm intensifying, they couldn't stay to help Margaret and the children reach the relative safety of their homestead. "I'm sorry, Margaret," Jack had said, his eyes avoiding hers as he prepared to leave. "If it wasn't for my own little ones. Daniel was a good man, too good for this godless country." And so Margaret Sullivan found herself alone, watching the snow pile higher against the door of their cabin, knowing that each passing hour brought her children closer to joining their father. The food Kennedy had brought was nearly gone now, and the temperature had dropped so severely that ice formed on the inside of their windows. Despite the small fire she struggled to maintain. As daylight began to fade on what Margaret feared would be their last night together, she heard something that made her blood freeze colder than the air outside, hoofbeats approaching through the snow. Had the outlaws returned to take what little remained? She reached for Daniel's hunting rifle, though she knew only 3 bullets remained. William stood beside her, his young face set with determination beyond his years. A fire poker clutched in his hands. "Get behind me with Emma and James," Margaret whispered, her injured arm protesting as she raised the rifle. The door rattled, then swung open on its damaged hinges. Snow swirled in, followed by a tall figure wrapped in buffalo hides. Margaret aimed the rifle with trembling hands. "Stay back," she warned, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll shoot." The figure paused, then slowly raised his hands, pushing back the hood that covered his face. Margaret's finger hesitated on the trigger. Standing before her was a Comanche warrior, his raven black hair adorned with a single eagle feather, his face bearing the marks of one who held high standing among his people. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, deep and intelligent, assessing her family's desperate situation with a single sweeping glance. "I mean no harm," he said in clear, though accented English. "I am Swift Arrow of the Southern Comanche. I saw smoke from your chimney. Strange, so far from others in such weather." Margaret's grip on the rifle faltered, the weapon suddenly impossibly heavy for her injured arm. Behind her, she felt William's presence, steady and protective despite his youth. "If you've come to kill us, you're too late," she said bitterly. "This place has already been visited by devils." Swift Arrow stepped further into the cabin, his gaze taking in the overturned furniture, the empty food storage shelves, the pallor of hunger on the children's faces. His expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his dark eyes, recognition, perhaps, of the kind of violence that had occurred here. "Not Comanche work," he said firmly. "White men did this." Margaret laughed, a hollow sound that held no humor. "Yes, white men, my own kind." The rifle slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. "So finish what they started. We don't have the strength to fight anymore." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead of reaching for a weapon, Swift Arrow moved to the fireplace, adding wood from a bundle he had carried in with him. The flames leapt higher, casting flickering shadows across the walls of the cabin. The sudden warmth drew little James from his hiding place behind his mother, his curiosity momentarily overcoming his fear. "Why would I kill a woman and children who are already embracing death?" Swift Arrow asked, his back still to Margaret. "That brings no honor." Margaret stared at him in confusion. Everything she had ever heard about the Comanche painted them as merciless raiders who took delight in the suffering of settlers. Yet here was one building up her fire instead of burning her cabin to the ground. "Then why are you here?" she managed to ask, unconsciously cradling her injured arm. Swift Arrow turned to face her, his expression solemn. "I track 6 men on painted horses. They attacked Comanche hunting party 3 days' ride from here, killed 4 of my people, including my brother's son." Margaret's heart sank. 4 men came here. They took everything, beat me, left us to die. My husband—" Her voice broke. "My husband died trying to get back to us through the storm." For a long moment, Swift Arrow was silent, studying Margaret and her children with an intensity that made her want to shield them from his gaze. Then he nodded once, as if coming to a decision. "These men are enemies to both our peoples," he said, "but you will not live to see them punished if you stay here." He moved around the small cabin, gathering what few items remained intact. A blanket, a dented pot, a small sack of cornmeal the raiders had overlooked. Margaret watched him in bewilderment. "What are you doing?" she asked. "You cannot stay," he said simply. "The storm comes again. No food, little wood. You will die." Margaret closed her eyes, exhaustion washing over her. "Perhaps that's for the best. There's nothing left for us here." Swift Arrow paused in his preparations, fixing her with a stern gaze. "Your spirit has been broken like a young horse thrown too roughly, but a broken thing can be mended if the will is there." "And if the will isn't there?" Margaret challenged, a spark of her old fire momentarily returning. "Then I have made a mistake in coming here," he replied, "and these children have the wrong mother." Those words, so unexpected and direct, struck Margaret like a physical blow. She looked at her children, William standing tall despite the fear. In his eyes, Emma clutching little James, both of them watching this exchange with the solemn gravity of children who had seen too much tragedy. "I can barely walk," she admitted, shame coloring her voice. "My shoulder—" "When they attacked me," Swift Arrow nodded. "I see how you hold yourself, but I have medicines, and my winter camp is 2 days' ride from here. It is your choice. Stay and join your husband in death, or come with me, and perhaps find a reason for your children to live." Put so starkly, the choice seemed both impossible and obvious. Margaret thought of Daniel, of how he had always admired her determination, her refusal to surrender, even when Cincinnati's bitter poverty had tested them beyond measure. Would he want her to give up now, to let their children perish when there was even the slimmest chance of survival? "Why would you help us?" she asked, needing to understand. We're nothing to you." Swift Arrow was silent for a moment, his gaze turning to the window where the snow continued to fall in thick white sheets. "My grandfather was a great chief," he finally said. "He taught me that our actions toward those in need define us more than our actions in battle. A warrior who ignores suffering is no warrior at all." He turned back to her, his expression softening slightly. "And you are not nothing. You are a mother who has faced evil and still draws breath. That deserves respect." Emma stepped forward then, her small face serious. "Can you really help my mama's arm? She can't lift it since the bad men came." Swift Arrow crouched to the child's level, his imposing presence somehow gentling. "Yes, little one, I have medicines that will ease your mother's pain. My sister is a healer who can make the arm strong again." "Do you have food?" William asked bluntly, protective suspicion warring with desperate hope in his young face. A ghost of a smile touched Swift Arrow's lips. "Yes, boy, my people do not starve in winter, we prepare." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes for the first time since Daniel's death. She had been holding her grief at bay, knowing that to give in to it would be to surrender to despair. But this unexpected kindness from a man she had been taught to fear broke something open inside her. "I'll come with you," she whispered, her voice stronger than she expected. "If only because Daniel would never forgive me for giving up without a fight." Relief flickered briefly across Swift Arrow's stoic features. "Good. We leave when the storm pauses. There will be a break before dawn." He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "I must see to my horse and prepare shelter for the night. Rest now. Tomorrow will test your strength." After he left, Margaret sank back against the wall, her mind reeling from the strange turn her fate had taken. She had expected to die alone, in this cabin, another nameless victim of the frontier's harsh realities. Instead, she found herself placing her life and the lives of her children in the hands of a Comanche war chief, a man who, by all accounts, should have been her enemy. As the fire crackled in the hearth, William came to sit beside her. "Can we trust him, Ma?" he asked, his voice low so his siblings wouldn't hear. Margaret considered the question carefully. "I don't know, Will, but I do know we'll die if we stay here. Sometimes the only choice is to take a chance." Swift Arrow returned an hour later, carrying a bundle of furs and a small leather pouch. Without a word, he set about preparing a tea with dried herbs from the pouch, the pungent aroma filling the small cabin. When he handed the steaming cup to Margaret, she hesitated only briefly before drinking the bitter liquid. Almost immediately, the worst of her pain began to subside. "What is this?" she asked, surprised by the medicine's effectiveness. "Old knowledge," Swift Arrow replied simply, "from a time before your people came to these lands." He then examined her injured shoulder with a healer's practiced eye, his touch clinical and respectful. With swift, sure movements he manipulated the joint, causing Margaret to cry out once before the shoulder slipped back into place with an audible pop. "The binding was wrong," he explained as he wrapped her arm with strips of soft buckskin, supporting it in a sling. "The bone must sit in its cradle properly to heal." His efficiency suggested he had done this many times before, perhaps for warriors injured in battle. As he worked, Margaret studied his face, noting the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of a man in his early 40s, perhaps close to her own age. Despite his imposing presence, there was something in his manner that gradually eased her initial fear. A steadiness, a lack of brutality that contradicted everything she'd been told about his people. "You speak English very well," she observed. As he finished securing the bandage, Swift Arrow's expression revealed nothing. "I spent 3 summers at the trading post at Fort Griffin as a young man. I learned your tongue, your ways. Knowledge of an enemy is a weapon more valuable than any bow or rifle." "Am I your enemy?" Margaret asked quietly, aware of her children. Listening intently to their exchange, Swift Arrow regarded her thoughtfully. "You are a woman who has suffered at the hands of men without honor. That makes you something else entirely." He paused, then added, "Sleep now. The medicine will help. Tomorrow comes early." The children, exhausted by days of fear and hunger, quickly succumbed to slumber, huddled together on their shared pallet near the revived fire. Margaret wanted to ask more questions, but the herbal tea was making her eyelids heavy, the pain receding enough to allow sleep to approach. As she drifted off, she heard Swift Arrow moving about the cabin, securing what he could against the elements before settling himself near the door, a silent sentinel between her family and the dangers of the night. Her last conscious thought was that she had entrusted her life to a man who, by all rights, should have considered her an intruder on his ancestral lands. Yet something told her that with Swift Arrow, her broken family might be safer than it had been among her own kind. The frontier had begun to change her notions of friend and foe, of where safety could be found in a world that often seemed determined to destroy the unwary. The medicine had worked wonders on her pain. But as Margaret slipped into the first peaceful sleep she'd had since Daniel's death, she knew the journey ahead would test not just her physical strength, but everything she had been raised to believe about the divide between their worlds. Dawn broke with eerie silence, the storm having paused as Swift Arrow had predicted. Margaret awoke to find the Comanche already preparing for their departure, his movements efficient in the grey morning light. Her children were still sleeping, their faces peaceful for the first time in days. "The snow has stopped for now," Swift Arrow said when he noticed her watching. "We must move quickly before it returns." Margaret nodded, testing her injured shoulder. The pain had diminished to a dull ache, allowing her more movement than she'd had since the attack. Still, the prospect of traveling through deep snow with 3 children seemed nearly impossible. "How will we manage?" she asked, gesturing to her sleeping children. "They can't walk far in these conditions." Swift Arrow had anticipated this problem. Outside, he had fashioned a travois from branches taken from the woodpile and strips of leather from his own gear. "The 2 smaller ones can ride here," he explained, showing her the sturdy construction. "I will pull it through the snow. The boy can ride my horse." "And me?" Margaret asked, trying to hide her apprehension. Swift Arrow's dark eyes assessed her frankly. "You will walk beside me. The medicine makes you stronger, but the journey will still test you." As Margaret roused her children and helped them dress in what warm clothing remained, she felt a strange mixture of fear and resolve. They would be leaving behind everything familiar. The cabin Daniel had built with such hope, his nearby grave, the small piece of frontier they had briefly called their own. "We're going with the Indian, Ma?" William asked quietly as she wrapped his father's too large scarf around his neck. "His name is Swift Arrow," Margaret corrected gently. "And yes, we're going with him. It's our only chance, Will." The boy nodded solemnly. At 10, he understood their desperate situation better than his siblings. "Pa would want us to survive," he said with conviction beyond his years. Emma approached the travois with trepidation, clutching little James's hand. "Will it hold us both?" she asked, eyeing the construction doubtfully. Swift Arrow demonstrated its strength, showing how the branches had been lashed together to distribute weight evenly. "It has carried wounded warriors heavier than 2 small children," he assured. James, whose natural curiosity had always outweighed his caution, climbed aboard without hesitation. "It's like a sleigh, Emma," he exclaimed, his childish delight momentarily piercing the gravity of their situation. Before departing, Margaret took one final look around the cabin that had briefly been their home. On impulse, she retrieved Daniel's Bible from where she'd left it and the small pouch of seed pearls from beneath the floorboard. "These are all we have left," she explained to Swift Arrow's questioning look. "Something of the past to carry into whatever future awaits us." The Comanche nodded, understanding in his eyes. The Comanche also carry memory tokens, things that connect us to those who have walked on to the spirit world. Their departure was somber. Margaret couldn't bring herself to look back as they left. The clearing where the cabin stood, looking back, meant acknowledging all they were leaving behind, especially Daniel's grave, now covered with snow, with only a simple wooden cross to mark it. The journey began in silence. Swift Arrow led the way, pulling the travois with Emma and James through snow that sometimes reached above his knees. William rode the painted horse, clearly uncomfortable, but determined not to complain. Margaret walked alongside, each step requiring concentration to keep her balance in the deep drifts. Within an hour, the physical toll became apparent. Margaret's legs burned with effort, her lungs aching in the frigid air. Swift Arrow noticed her labored breathing and called a brief halt, in the shelter of a stand of pines. "You push yourself too hard," he observed, offering her water from his skin. "Pace is important for a long journey." Margaret accepted the water gratefully. "How far is your winter camp?" 2 days' travel in good conditions," Swift Arrow replied. With the snow and children, perhaps 3, the reality of what lay ahead settled over Margaret like a weight. 3 days in these conditions seemed impossibly daunting. Already her body protested every movement, her injured shoulder throbbing. Despite the medicine's effects, "I'll manage," she said, straightening her shoulders despite the pain. Swift Arrow studied her for a moment. "The Sullivan woman has courage," he remarked, using her surname in the formal Comanche way. "But courage alone will not cross frozen land." He gestured to the travois. "You will ride with the children when your strength fails. No shame in this." Margaret started to protest, but the firm set of his jaw told her the decision wasn't open for debate. With as much dignity as she could muster, she nodded her acceptance of his plan. They continued through the morning, the landscape transforming. A swift arrow led them away from the scattered homesteads and into wilder territory. The rolling plains gave way to more rugged terrain, with rocky outcroppings and stands of pine and cedar, providing occasional shelter from the biting wind. By midday, Margaret's strength was failing rapidly. Without a word, Swift Arrow helped her onto the travois with Emma and James, redistributing their meager belongings to maintain balance. The children welcomed her, huddling close for warmth as Swift Arrow continued pulling them through the deepening snow. William, seeing his mother's exhaustion, slid from the horse. "I can walk for a while," he offered, his young face serious with responsibility. Swift Arrow assessed the boy with new respect. "A short distance only," he agreed. "Then back on the horse. We must preserve strength." As they traveled, James peppered Swift Arrow with questions whenever they stopped to rest. Despite the gravity of their situation, the 5-year-old's natural curiosity couldn't be suppressed. "Are you a real Indian chief?" he asked during one such pause. Swift Arrow's stern expression softened slightly. "I am a war chief of the southern Comanche. My people are called the Numunu, those who walk with the sun. Do you fight cowboys?" James continued, his imagination fired by the dime novels Daniel had sometimes read to the children. "I fight those who threaten my people," Swift Arrow corrected. "Not all who wear cowboy hats are enemies. Not all with pale skin are friends." Margaret, resting nearby, was struck by the wisdom in this simple explanation. How different from the stark divisions she had been raised to accept. Civilized versus savage, Christian versus heathen, settler versus Indian. By late afternoon, the weather began to deteriorate. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind picked up, driving icy particles against their faces. Swift Arrow scanned the landscape with growing concern. "The storm returns sooner than I expected," he said, his voice barely audible above the rising wind. "We must find shelter before nightfall." Margaret felt fear rising in her throat. They were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but snow-covered hills and scattered trees. What shelter could possibly exist in this desolation? Swift Arrow pointed to a distant ridge. There is a place ahead, a cave my people use when hunting in these lands. If we reach it before the worst comes... He didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the consequences of being caught in the open when the blizzard struck with full force. Their pace increased, Swift Arrow pulling the travois with renewed urgency. William was back on the horse, leaning forward against the intensifying wind. The temperature dropped rapidly as the sun disappeared behind the approaching storm clouds. Margaret held her younger children close on the travois, trying to shield them from the worst of the wind. Emma had stopped asking questions, her face buried against her mother's side. Even James had fallen silent, sensing the danger in their situation. When the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, Swift Arrow's expression grew grim. "We must move faster," he said, abandoning his usual measured pace for longer strides that jerked the travois roughly over the uneven ground. The distant ridge seemed to recede rather than draw closer, a cruel illusion created by the deteriorating visibility. Margaret found herself praying, something she hadn't done since receiving news of Daniel's death. Not elaborate prayers from church services, but desperate pleas for her children's survival. As the snowfall intensified, transforming into near whiteout conditions, Swift Arrow suddenly stopped, his head cocked as if listening for something beyond the howling wind. "What is it?" Margaret called, her voice whipped away by the gale. Instead of answering, Swift Arrow made a sharp turn to the right, pulling them toward what appeared to be a solid wall of snow-covered rock. Only as they drew closer did Margaret discern a dark opening, nearly invisible against the white landscape. "The cave," Swift Arrow announced with evident relief. "We reached it just in time." The opening was narrow, but widened into a surprisingly spacious chamber within the ridge. Swift Arrow helped Margaret and the children from the travois, then led his horse inside. The sudden absence of wind felt like a blessing, the relative quiet almost shocking after hours of the storm's howl in their ears. Using flint and dry kindling, he carried in a waterproof pouch. Swift Arrow soon had a small fire burning near the cave entrance, positioned so the smoke would rise toward a natural chimney in the rock ceiling. As warmth gradually returned to their frozen limbs, Margaret surveyed their shelter with growing appreciation. The cave was dry, the floor sandy rather, than rocky, with signs of previous occupation, charred circles from old fires, a crude stone bench along one wall. "Your people know this place well," she observed. Swift Arrow nodded as he arranged their belongings and set out a meager meal of dried meat and berries. "Many generations have sheltered here. The old ones say Skyfather created these caves specifically to protect the people during winter hunts." The children, revived by food and warmth, explored the cave's main chamber with cautious excitement. William discovered stone carvings near the back wall, handprints, animal figures, and symbols Margaret couldn't interpret. "Ancient markings," Swift Arrow explained, "stories of hunts and battles from before my grandfather's grandfather was born." Margaret touched one of the handprints, smaller than her own, perhaps a child's hand pressed against stone countless years ago. The tangible connection to human lives long past provided unexpected comfort. They weren't the first to seek refuge here. They wouldn't be the last. As night fell outside, the storm's fury increased. Winds screamed past the cave entrance, occasionally driving swirls of snow inside despite the protective overhang. Swift Arrow built up the fire, then arranged sleeping furs in a semicircle around it. "Rest," he instructed. "Tomorrow will be difficult. The storm may last several days." Several days. The implications of his words sank in slowly. Their food was limited, their situation precarious despite the shelter. Margaret looked at her children, already curled together on the furs, exhausted by the day's ordeal, and felt a renewed surge of determination. They had survived the attack on their home. Daniel's death, the beginning of starvation. They had found unexpected help in the most unlikely form. Somehow, they would endure this storm as well. As Margaret settled beside her children, she noticed Swift Arrow positioning himself near the cave entrance, ever vigilant, even as they rested. "You should sleep too," she suggested. Swift Arrow's silhouette remained motionless against the darkness. "I will watch first," he said simply. "The storm brings more than snow." Something in his tone raised the hairs on Margaret's neck. "What do you mean?" Swift Arrow turned slightly, his profile illuminated by the fire's glow. "The men who attacked your home and killed my people, they move in this storm as well. Like wolves, they hunt even in the worst weather." Margaret pulled her children closer, suddenly aware that their journey had only just begun, and the dangers they faced extended far beyond the merciless Colorado winter. Morning brought little change in their circumstances. The storm continued, unabated, the cave entrance partially blocked by drifting snow that Swift Arrow cleared periodically. The children remained huddled near the fire, their initial excitement at the adventure giving way to restless boredom. Swift Arrow had disappeared before dawn, venturing into the storm despite Margaret's concerned objections. He had returned 2 hours later covered in snow, but carrying 2 rabbits trapped in the nearby woods. "You hunt even in this?" Margaret asked, as he set about preparing the unexpected bounty. "Hunger does not wait for fair weather," he replied, his skilled hands working with practiced efficiency. "Neither do those who track us." This reminder of the threat beyond the storm sent a chill through Margaret. "Did you see signs of them?" Swift Arrow shook his head. "The snow covers all tracks, quickly, but men like those who attacked your home are persistent. They leave witnesses rarely." As he prepared the rabbits for cooking, Margaret studied him with new curiosity. In the day since he had appeared at her cabin door, there had been little opportunity for conversation beyond immediate concerns of survival. Now, trapped by the storm with hours stretching before them, she found herself wanting to understand this man who had risked his own safety to save her family. "You never told me why you were traveling alone," she ventured. "Don't Comanche warriors usually move in groups?" Swift Arrow was silent for a moment, considering how much to share. "I was returning from a meeting with other tribal leaders at Medicine Mound," he finally explained. "Discussions about the white government's latest demands for our lands." He arranged the rabbit meat on green branches over the fire. "I chose to travel alone on my return. Sometimes solitude brings clarity when decisions are difficult." "What decisions?" Margaret asked, accepting a cup of pine needle tea he had brewed. Swift Arrow's expression grew distant. "Whether to continue fighting for lands that seem more lost with each passing season, or to lead my people to the reservation, where at least the children might survive, even if our way of life does not." The gravity of his dilemma struck Margaret forcefully. Her own losses seemed suddenly personal rather than systemic, the actions of particular outlaws rather than an entire civilization's policy. "What will you decide?" she asked softly. "The coming moons will tell," he answered, his tone making it clear this was not a topic he wished to pursue further. William had been listening to their exchange with undisguised interest. Unlike his younger siblings, who remained wary of their rescuer, William had begun to observe Swift Arrow with open admiration. "Could you teach me to hunt like you do?" the boy asked suddenly. "Pa was going to teach me when I turned 12, but now—" Swift Arrow regarded the child thoughtfully. "Your father hunted?" William nodded eagerly. "He got us a deer last fall. Said I could use his rifle when my arms were stronger." A hint of approval crossed Swift Arrow's face. "There are many ways to hunt. Some require no rifle, only patience and understanding of animal ways." He gestured to the cooking rabbits. These were caught with snares set where rabbits seek shelter from storms. The impromptu lesson that followed captivated not only William, but Emma and James as well. Swift Arrow demonstrated how to create simple snares using materials available in their surroundings, explaining how to identify animal trails even when covered by snow, and describing how different creatures behaved during winter storms. Margaret watched with growing appreciation as her children's fear of the Comanche warrior gradually transformed into fascination. Swift Arrow showed unexpected patience with their questions, his stern demeanor softening when addressing their curiosity. When the rabbit was cooked, they shared the modest feast with ceremonial gratitude that Swift Arrow insisted upon. "We honor the creatures who give their lives so we may continue our journey," he explained, teaching the children to offer a small portion back to the fire first. The simple ritual touched Margaret deeply, reminding her of her own grandmother's insistence on saying grace before meals, different traditions, acknowledging the same fundamental gratitude for sustenance. As the day progressed, James grew increasingly restless. The active 5-year-old was unaccustomed to confinement, his energy building until even Emma's patient storytelling couldn't distract him from his discomfort. Noticing the child's agitation, Swift Arrow reached into a small pouch at his waist and withdrew several smooth stones of different colors. With deft movements, he arranged them in a pattern on the cave floor. "This is fox and geese," he explained, demonstrating how the stones could be moved in a hunting game that required strategy and foresight. "My father taught me this game when I was no bigger than you, little warrior." James was immediately enthralled, his restlessness channeled into learning the new game. Soon Emma joined in, and even William abandoned his pretense of disinterest to watch the competition between his siblings. "You're good with children," Margaret observed quietly as Swift Arrow supervised the game. "Do you have some of your own?" A shadow crossed his face. "I had a son. He would be 12 winters now." The use of past tense told Margaret everything she needed to know. "I'm sorry," she said simply, understanding too well the pain of such loss. "His mother, Prairie Flower, died bringing him into the world," Swift Arrow continued after a moment. "He lived only long enough to be named, Running Fox, for the way his spirit seemed too quick for his small body." Margaret's heart ached at the quiet dignity with which he shared his grief. "Daniel always said that the children we lose remain with us in ways we can't explain," she offered, "that they become part of who we are." Swift Arrow nodded slowly. "The Comanche believe those who have walked on are never truly gone. Their spirits remain to guide us until we join them beyond the stars." The parallels between their beliefs created an unexpected bridge between their worlds. For all their differences in culture and experience, they shared the universal language of loss and the human need to find meaning in suffering. As evening approached again, the storm showed signs of weakening. The howling wind diminished to occasional gusts, and the snowfall became lighter, allowing glimpses of grey sky through the cave entrance. "We may be able to continue our journey tomorrow," Swift Arrow announced as he added more wood to their fire. "The worst has passed." This news brought mixed reactions from the Sullivans. The children, having adjusted to the cave's relative comfort and safety, seemed apprehensive about venturing into the cold again. Margaret shared their concerns, but recognized that remaining stationary only prolonged their vulnerability. "How much farther to your winter camp?" she asked, mentally preparing herself for the challenges ahead. "If the snow allows, perhaps one more day of travel," Swift Arrow replied. "My people will have moved to the sheltered valley by Bear Creek where the high cliffs block the worst winds." He paused, studying her face. "You should know what awaits you there, Margaret Sullivan." It was the first time he had addressed her by her full name, and something in his tone made her uneasy. "Will they welcome us?" she asked, already suspecting the answer. Swift Arrow chose his words carefully. "My people have suffered much at the hands of white settlers," Some have lost children, parents, entire families to soldiers and those who seek our lands. He crouched down to her level, his dark eyes intent. They will see your face and remember their pain. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. Perhaps this was a mistake, she whispered, glancing at her children. I never considered what our presence might mean to your people. You will be under my protection, Swift Arrow stated firmly. No harm will come to you or your children, but there will be distrust, perhaps even anger. You must be prepared. The reality of their situation struck Margaret with new force. In focusing on immediate survival, she hadn't fully considered the implications of seeking refuge with the very people her own kind had systematically displaced and persecuted. And after? She pressed. What happens to us once the winter passes? A faint smile touched Swift Arrow's lips. One step at a time, Margaret Sullivan. First you must heal, and your children must be fed. Then we will speak of what comes after. That night, as her children slept peacefully for the first time since Daniel's death, Margaret remained awake, watching the dying embers of their fire. Swift Arrow sat near the cave entrance, his profile silhouetted against the faint moonlight, now visible through breaks in the clouds. You should rest, he said without turning. Tomorrow's journey will be difficult. I keep thinking about what awaits us at your camp, Margaret admitted. What right do I have to bring my children among people who have every reason to hate us? Swift Arrow turned to face her, his expression thoughtful in the dim light. Hate is a luxury not easily afforded during winter, he said. Survival demands cooperation, even among those with reason to be enemies. He added another small branch to the fire. Besides, your children have not yet learned to hate. Perhaps they will teach the elders something important by their presence. And what would that be? Margaret asked. That the future need not be enslaved. Unto the past, Swift Arrow replied. That new paths can be found if we are brave enough to walk them. His words settled over Margaret like a warm blanket, offering unexpected comfort. Whatever challenges awaited them at the Comanche winter camp, she would face them with the same courage that had sustained her through the loss of Daniel and the attack on their home. As if reading her thoughts, Swift Arrow added, You have survived. Much already, Margaret Sullivan. Perhaps you are stronger than you know. In that moment, something shifted between them. Not quite friendship yet, but a recognition of shared resilience that transcended the divisions of their worlds. They were no longer simply rescuer and rescued, but two people who had glimpsed something recognizable in each other's spirit. Outside, the storm continued to abate, stars occasionally visible through breaks in the clouds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, in the shelter of the ancient cave, Margaret allowed herself to believe that perhaps Swift Arrow was right. Perhaps she was stronger than she knew, and perhaps the future held possibilities she had not yet dared to imagine. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm having exhausted itself during the night. Outside the cave, a transformed landscape awaited them. Pristine white drifts sculpted by wind into fantastical shapes. Tree branches bowed under the weight of snow, the rising sun casting a rose-gold glow over everything. Swift Arrow had already been outside, clearing a path from the cave entrance and assessing conditions for travel. The snow is deep, but firm enough to walk upon, he reported. If we leave now, we can reach the winter camp before nightfall. The children, fortified by a breakfast of the remaining rabbit meat, seemed energized by the prospect of continuing their journey. Even Margaret felt stronger, Swift Arrow's medicines and the day of rest having eased the worst of her shoulder pain. They departed the cave shelter with mixed emotions, gratitude for its protection, apprehension about what lay ahead. Swift Arrow had rearranged the travois to better distribute weight in the deep snow, placing Emma and James on his horse, while Margaret and William would walk alongside. Stay in my tracks, he instructed as they set out. "The snow may hide holes or fallen logs that could cause injury." The morning's journey was arduous, but manageable. The snowfall had created a strange hush over the landscape, their breathing and the crunch of snow beneath their feet, the only sounds breaking the silence. Occasionally, Swift Arrow would point out animal tracks or interesting features of the terrain, his knowledge of the land evident in the way he navigated seemingly featureless expanses with confidence. By midday, the temperature had risen enough to make the snow wetter and heavier, their progress slowing as each step became more laborious. William, despite his determination to prove his strength, was clearly tiring, his breath coming in visible puffs as he struggled to keep pace. "Your son has courage," Swift Arrow observed to Margaret during a brief rest, "but his body is not yet as strong as his spirit." Without further discussion, he lifted William onto the horse with his siblings, ignoring the boy's protest that he could continue walking. "A wise warrior knows when to conserve strength," Swift Arrow told him firmly. "There is no shame in riding when the snow is deep and the journey long." This simple acknowledgement of William's effort, while offering him an honorable way to accept, helped struck Margaret as remarkably insightful. How differently Daniel might have handled the situation, perhaps urging the boy to continue beyond his limits in the name of building character. As they resumed their journey, Margaret found herself walking alongside Swift Arrow, the shared labor of breaking trail through the snow, creating a natural opportunity for conversation. "You mentioned teaching your son the hunting game," she ventured. "Were there other traditions you looked forward to sharing with him?" Swift Arrow was silent for several steps, and Margaret worried she had overstepped, but then he began to speak, his voice low enough that the children on the horse behind them couldn't hear. "When a Comanche boy reaches his 7th summer, his father teaches him to ride, not just to sit upon a horse, but to become one with it, to communicate without words, to trust the animal's instincts as much as his own." A distant look came into his eyes as he continued. "At 10 summers, he learns to use the bow, starting with small game. At 13, he joins his first buffalo hunt, though only to observe and learn. These passages mark the journey to manhood." Margaret thought of her own son, of the traditions Daniel had planned to pass on, how to plough a straight furrow, smith a horseshoe, read the stars for navigation. Different skills for a different world, yet the same fundamental desire to prepare a child for the future. "What about your daughters?" she asked. "What traditions await them?" Swift Arrow's expression softened slightly. "Comanche girls learn from their mothers and aunts, how to prepare hides for teepees, how to find healing plants, how to move camp efficiently. Some learn to ride and hunt as well as any warrior. My sister, Singing Grass, counted coup against Osage raiders who threatened our village when she was barely 16 summers. The image of such a young woman riding fearlessly into battle was so far removed from the demure expectations placed on girls in Margaret's world that she found herself momentarily speechless. Misinterpreting her silence, Swift Arrow added, "Your daughters will not be forced into Comanche ways. They will remain your children under your guidance." "I was just thinking how different our worlds are," Margaret explained. "In Cincinnati, a girl who even expressed interest in riding astride rather than side saddle would be considered improper. A woman who hunted or fought would be unthinkable." Swift Arrow considered this. "Your ways waste half your tribe's strength," he observed matter-of-factly. "No wonder the white man must constantly seek new lands. You allow only half your people to truly live." The blunt assessment startled Margaret, but she found she couldn't entirely disagree. How often had she chafed against the limitations placed on her as a woman, even as she dutifully accepted them as the natural order? Their conversation was interrupted by a cry from Emma, who had spotted something in the distance. "Look, people on horses!" Swift Arrow immediately halted, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. Margaret followed his gaze and saw 3 mounted figures silhouetted against the sky, about half a mile ahead, apparently watching their approach. Comanche scouts. Swift Arrow confirmed after a moment. They monitor the boundaries of our winter territory. He reached for his bow, notched an arrow, and fired it high into the air. The arrow arced gracefully, leaving a thin black line against the blue sky before falling to the snow some distance away. "A signal?" Margaret asked. Swift Arrow nodded. "To identify myself. They will approach now." The mounted figures began moving toward them at a steady pace. As they drew closer, Margaret could distinguish 2 men and a youth, all wrapped in buffalo robes against the cold, feathers adorning their long black hair. The children fell silent, tension evident in their rigid postures. Even William, who had shown the most interest in Comanche ways, pressed closer to his siblings as the riders approached. The lead scout, a weathered man with a face carved by decades of frontier life, reined his horse to a stop several yards away. He and Swift Arrow exchanged words in Comanche, the conversation punctuated by glances toward Margaret and her children. Margaret stood straighter, conscious of being evaluated. Though she couldn't understand the words, she recognized when the discussion became heated, the older scout's voice rising as he gestured emphatically toward her family. Finally, Swift Arrow's authoritative response seemed to settle the matter, though the scout's displeasure remained evident in his posture. "Well, what's happening?" Margaret asked quietly when Swift Arrow turned back to her. "Black Knife questions my decision to bring white settlers to our camp," he explained frankly. "He lost his youngest son to Texas Rangers last summer. The wound is still fresh." "And what did you tell him?" "That you are under my protection, that your children were starving, and that the same men who attacked your home killed our hunters." Swift Arrow's expression remained impassive. "He does not agree, but he respects my position as war chief." The scouting party would escort them the remainder of the way, Swift Arrow explained. Black Knife and the other adult scout would ride ahead to warn the camp of their approach, while the youth, a boy of perhaps 14, would accompany them. As they resumed their journey, Margaret studied their young escort, noting his wary glances and the way he kept his hand near his knife. Despite his youth, his eyes held the hardened look of someone who had witnessed too much violence. "That's Jumping Badger," Swift Arrow told her quietly. "Black Knife's remaining son. He has reason to distrust white faces." Understanding dawned as Margaret made the connection. This boy had lost his brother to violence from people who looked like her. No wonder his gaze held such suspicion. The terrain gradually changed as they traveled, becoming more varied with stands of cedar and oak, providing welcome breaks from the open snowfields. By mid-afternoon, they began descending into a sheltered valley, just as Swift Arrow had described, a natural basin protected on 3 sides by rising cliffs. From their vantage point on the ridge, Margaret could see the Comanche winter camp. Spread below, perhaps 30 teepees arranged in a large circle, smoke rising from their tops, figures moving among them, tending to daily tasks despite the snow. "It's larger than I expected," she murmured. 3 bands together for winter," Swift Arrow explained, "stronger against both weather and enemies." He turned to her, his expression serious once more. "Remember what I told you. Stay close to me. Speak only when spoken to. Show no fear, but no arrogance either." Margaret nodded, her heart pounding with apprehension. She gathered her children close, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "We'll be all right," she assured them, as much for her own benefit as theirs. "Swift Arrow will protect us." Their approach to the camp was noticed immediately. Black Knife and his companion had clearly spread word of their coming, as much of the camp's activity ceased. People emerged from teepees to watch, their faces impassive. As the strange procession made its way down the slope, children pointed and called out questions in Comanche, while women gathered in small groups, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Warriors stood at strategic points throughout the camp, some with hands resting on weapons. As they reached the edge of the circle of teepees, an elder stepped forward to meet them. A tall man with silver streaking his long hair and deep lines. Etched into his face, he carried himself with unmistakable authority, his gaze penetrating as it moved from Swift Arrow to the Sullivan family. "Standing Bear," Swift Arrow murmured to Margaret. "Chief of the Antelope Band, a wise leader but cautious with outsiders." Standing Bear spoke rapidly in Comanche, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. Swift Arrow replied calmly, occasionally gesturing toward her and the children. Margaret remained still, conscious of dozens of stares fixed upon them, measuring, judging, remembering. Finally, Standing Bear approached, stopping directly before Margaret. He studied her with piercing eyes, then spoke in halting English. "Swift Arrow says white men left you to die, same men who killed our hunters." His weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Why should we welcome the enemy into our camp?" Margaret met his gaze directly, remembering Swift Arrow's advice not to show fear. "I am not your enemy, Chief Standing Bear. My children and I seek no harm to your people. Yet harm follows the white man like shadow follows sun," Standing Bear countered, his eyes moving to William, Emma, and James, who pressed closer to their mother. Swift Arrow spoke again in Comanche, his tone firm but respectful. Standing Bear listened, occasionally nodding, his expression gradually softening as he glanced at the children's frightened faces. "He saved our lives," Margaret said when Swift Arrow had finished. "Why would he do this?" Standing Bear's question caught her off guard. Why, indeed, had Swift Arrow risked his standing within his tribe to help a white woman and her children? "Because he is a man of honor," she answered simply. "Because he saw someone in need and chose compassion over hatred." Standing Bear considered her words, then turned to address the gathering in Comanche. After a brief discussion that Margaret could only observe through tone and gesture, he faced them again. "You may enter our camp," he pronounced. "Swift Arrow stands for you. If you bring trouble, it falls on him also." His stern expression softened slightly as he looked at the children. "We too know what it is to lose family to violence. The children will be fed." With that, the line of onlookers parted, allowing them to proceed into the camp. Children darted alongside them, staring openly at the Sullivan children with undisguised curiosity. Women paused in their work to watch, their expressions ranging from suspicion to curiosity to outright hostility. Swift Arrow led them toward a teepee near the center of the camp. It was larger than many of the others, with painted symbols adorning its hide covering. A woman stood outside, middle-aged but still striking, with the same proud bearing as Swift Arrow himself. "My sister Singing Grass," Swift Arrow explained as he helped Margaret dismount, "widow of Running Elk, who was killed by soldiers 2 winters ago." Margaret's heart sank. This was a woman who had directly suffered at the hands of white settlers. What welcome could she possibly expect here? To her surprise, Singing Grass inclined her head in greeting, her expression solemn but not unkind. She spoke briefly to Swift Arrow, who translated, "She says you are welcome to share her fire and food. She has prepared medicines for your shoulder. Please tell her I'm grateful," Margaret replied, humbled by this unexpected generosity from a woman who had every reason to resent her presence. As they were led into the warmth of the teepee, Margaret felt the weight of many eyes upon her back, some curious, some hostile, all watching to see what would come of Swift Arrow's extraordinary decision to bring white settlers into the heart of the Comanche winter camp. Inside the teepee, Margaret discovered a world unlike anything she had known before. The circular space was warm and surprisingly spacious, with buffalo robes covering the ground and personal belongings neatly arranged around the perimeter. A small fire burned in a central pit, its smoke rising to exit through the opening at the top. Singing Grass gestured for Margaret and her children to sit on robes near the fire, then began examining Margaret's injured shoulder with gentle but thorough hands. She spoke quietly to Swift Arrow as she worked. "My sister says your injury heals well, but the muscles remain too tight," he translated. "She will prepare medicine to help them relax." Singing Grass moved to a collection of pouches and bundles, selecting various herbs and roots with practiced efficiency. As she worked, a young girl of perhaps 7 entered the teepee, carrying a wooden bowl of steaming stew. She set it beside the Sullivan children, her dark eyes wide with wonder at these strange visitors. "My niece, Little Dove," Swift Arrow explained, "daughter of Singing Grass." The girl seemed fascinated by Emma's blonde hair, pointing to it and asking a question in Comanche that made Singing Grass smile as she responded. "She wants to know if the sun gave your daughter her hair," Swift Arrow translated, amusement flickering in his eyes. Emma, who had been clinging to Margaret's side since their arrival, relaxed slightly at this. "It's just the color it grew," she explained shyly to the girl, touching her own braids. Little Dove nodded solemnly, then surprised everyone by extending the bowl toward Emma specifically. The simple gesture of hospitality from child to child somehow cut through the tension more effectively than any adult diplomacy could have. Soon the Sullivan children were eating the rich buffalo stew, hunger overcoming their wariness. Margaret accepted a bowl as well, the first hot meal they'd had since the attack on their homestead. Swift Arrow excused himself, explaining that he needed to meet with the tribal council to discuss recent developments, including the raiders who had attacked both the Sullivan homestead and the Comanche hunting party. "You will be safe here with Singing Grass," he assured Margaret. "Rest, we will speak more later." After he departed, an unexpected quiet settled over the tipi. Despite the language barrier, Singing Grass managed to communicate through gestures and the few English words she knew. She applied a warm poultice to Margaret's shoulder, the pungent herbs seeping into sore muscles with remarkable effectiveness. Little Dove gradually overcame her shyness, showing Emma and James a string game, similar to Cat's Cradle, that transcended language differences. William maintained a cautious distance, his protective instincts clearly on alert in these unfamiliar surroundings. As dusk approached, more visitors arrived at the teepee, several women bringing additional furs, clothing, and food. Their manner was reserved but not hostile, curiosity evident in their surreptitious glances at the white family. One elderly woman, her face deeply lined with age, studied Margaret intently before speaking to Singing Grass in a tone that seemed approving. "Crooked Finger says you have strong eyes," Little Dove translated haltingly, surprising Margaret with her knowledge of English. "Not afraid, not angry. Good for mother." The simple assessment delivered through a child's translation touched Margaret deeply. To be seen as strong by a woman who had likely endured hardships she could barely imagine felt like an unexpected honor. As darkness fell, the teepee became a warm island of light against the cold winter night. The children, exhausted by the day's journey and the emotional strain of their arrival, soon fell asleep on the soft buffalo robes. Margaret remained awake, watching as Singing Grass moved about with quiet efficiency, preparing the space for sleep. In the flickering firelight, Margaret noticed for the first time a small medicine bundle hanging from one of the teepee poles. Seeing her interest, Singing Grass touched it gently, then pointed to Little Dove, speaking soft words in Comanche. The girl translated sleepily from her bed of furs. "For protection. Holds," she struggled for the English word, "spirit of her father." Margaret nodded in understanding, touching the Bible she had brought from her cabin. "Like this," she said, "memory." Singing Grass seemed to understand the comparison, a moment of connection passing between the two widows from vastly different worlds. Swift Arrow returned late, his expression troubled as he entered the teepee. He spoke briefly with his sister. In their language, the conversation hushed but intense. Margaret pretended to sleep, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly a private discussion, but she could sense the tension in Swift Arrow's posture. The next morning brought new challenges. Word had spread throughout the camp about the white family in their midst, drawing both the curious and the hostile. Children gathered outside the teepee, whispering and occasionally peering inside when the entrance flap was opened. Some warriors made a point of walking past, their expressions making their displeasure clear. Swift Arrow appeared early, bringing news that complicated their situation further. Scouts report a cavalry patrol moving along the river valley 20 miles east, he informed Margaret as they shared a breakfast of corn porridge. They search for something, or someone. The implication was clear. They might be looking for us, Margaret acknowledged. After the blizzard, neighbors would have checked our homestead, found it empty. If soldiers come here, it will not go well, Swift Arrow said, his voice low so the children wouldn't hear. There is too much bad blood already. Margaret felt the weight of this new complication. By seeking refuge with the Comanche, had she inadvertently put them at risk of a military confrontation? What should we do? She asked, genuine concern evident in her voice, not just for her family, but for the people who had offered them shelter despite every reason not to. Before Swift Arrow could respond, a commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Angry voices rose in Comanche, followed by the sound of rapidly approaching footsteps. The teepee flap was thrust aside abruptly, revealing Black Knife, the scout who had escorted them to the camp. His face was tight with anger as he strode inside, directing a stream of Comanche at Swift Arrow that needed no translation to understand its hostility. Swift Arrow rose to face him, his response measured but firm. The confrontation continued for several tense minutes, with singing grass occasionally interjecting in tones that seemed intended to calm both men. Margaret gathered her children close, acutely aware that they were the focus of Black Knife's anger. William positioned himself protectively in front of his siblings, his young face set with determination despite his fear. Finally, Standing Bear himself entered the teepee, his authoritative presence immediately changing the dynamic. He listened to both warriors, then spoke a few decisive words that ended the argument, though Black Knife's expression remained thunderous as he departed. "What happened?" Margaret asked when the tension had subsided somewhat. Swift Arrow exchanged glances with Standing Bear, who nodded slightly, authorizing him to explain. "The raiders who attacked your homestead have struck again," Swift Arrow told her grimly. "A trading post 12 miles west? They killed the trader and his son." Margaret gasped. "Mr. Blackwood's trading post? He and young Peter are dead?" "You knew these men?" Standing Bear asked sharply. Margaret nodded, distress evident in her face. "Thomas Blackwood traded fairly with everyone, settlers and Indian. Alike, his son was only 16. The raiders left a message this time," Swift Arrow continued, "written in blood on the wall of the trading post." He hesitated, glancing at the children, then continued in a lower voice. "It claimed the killings were Comanche revenge for white encroachment. They scattered feathers and arrows around the bodies." Margaret understood immediately the implications of this horrific staging. "They're trying to provoke a war," she whispered, "make it look like Comanche are responsible for their attacks." Standing Bear's weathered face was grave. "Already settlers gather at Fort Collins. Already they call for soldiers to punish Comanche for these killings. But that's not what happened," Margaret protested. "These raiders attacked my family too. They're the same men who killed your hunters." "Truth matters little when blood has been spilled," Standing Bear replied, the bitterness of long experience evident in his tone. "White settlers see only Comanche feathers, Comanche arrows. They do not ask who held them." Black Knife's anger now made terrible sense. The presence of a white family in their camp had become even more dangerous, both to the Sullivans and to the Comanche themselves. Some warriors say we should return you to your people, Swift Arrow explained, confirming Margaret's fears. That your presence brings danger to our camp. And what do you say? Margaret asked, meeting his gaze steadily. I say the raiders are the true enemy to both our peoples. Swift Arrow's jaw set with determination. And that you may be the key to proving this truth. Standing Bear studied Margaret thoughtfully. You saw these men. You could identify them to your people, tell what really happened. The chief's suggestion hung in the air between them, both an opportunity and a danger. If Margaret could convince the authorities of the truth, she might prevent a violent response against innocent Comanche. But reaching the fort would mean crossing dangerous territory, possibly encountering the very raiders who had attacked her home. I would need to leave immediately, Margaret said, thinking through the implications. Before the situation escalates further. Not alone, Swift Arrow countered. These men still hunt. They would silence you if they knew your purpose. Standing Bear frowned. If Comanche warriors approach the fort now, they will be shot on sight. An uncomfortable silence fell as they contemplated this dilemma. It was William who broke it, stepping forward with unexpected confidence. My pa always said the truth needs witnesses, the boy stated, his young voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. If Ma tells what happened, they have to listen. Swift Arrow regarded the child with new respect. Your son has your courage, Margaret Sullivan, and wisdom beyond his years. Standing Bear nodded slowly. The boy speaks truth, but the journey remains dangerous. I'll go, Margaret decided, drawing strength from her son's example. My children will stay here, where they're safe from the raiders. No, Emma cried, overhearing this part of the conversation. We stay together. You promised after Pa died. James began to cry, clinging to his mother's skirts. Even William, despite his brave words, looked stricken at the thought of separation. Margaret knelt to embrace her children, her heart torn between the necessity of her mission and her promise never to leave them. There may be another way, Swift Arrow said after a moment of consideration. A trusted trader, Samuel Jenkins, camps at Grey Rock 2 days from here. He carries messages between tribes and the Indian Agency. If we can reach him, he could escort you and your children to the fort safely. Standing Bear considered this alternative. Jenkins is known to me. He does not rush to blame Comanche for every trouble on the frontier. 2 days' journey, Margaret repeated, hope kindling, and my children could remain with me. Swift Arrow nodded. I would accompany you to Jenkins' camp. From there, he can ensure your safety to the fort. The plan was far from perfect, but it offered a balance between safety and urgency that seemed their best option. Still, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into escalating danger rather than away from it. Outside the teepee, the ordinary life of the camp continued. Women tanning hides, children playing in the snow, hunters preparing for the day's expedition. None of them yet realized how the actions of a few brutal raiders threatened to shatter the relative peace of their winter sanctuary. As Swift Arrow left to make preparations for their departure, Margaret caught a glimpse of Black Knife watching from across the camp, his expression making it clear that he believed she brought nothing but trouble to his people. The weight of his gaze followed her back into the tipi, a constant reminder of how precarious their situation had become. That night, as her children slept fitfully around her, Margaret silently prayed for guidance. The simple goal of survival that had driven her since Daniel's death had evolved into something far more complex, a responsibility not just to her own family, but to these people who had sheltered them despite every reason for suspicion. I won't let them start a war in our names, she whispered to the darkness, a promise to herself and to the sleeping camp around her. Neither my husband's death nor theirs will be used to spill more innocent blood. Preparations for their journey began at dawn. Swift Arrow selected two of his most trusted warriors to accompany them, Running Fox, a young man with exceptional tracking skills, and Grey Wolf, an older warrior known for his wisdom in difficult situations. Black Knife had demanded to join the party as well, his distrust of Margaret clear in every rigid line of his body. "He does not believe you will speak truth to your people," Swift Arrow explained as they packed the few supplies they would need. "He comes to watch, not to help." Margaret understood the warrior's suspicion, though it stung. "He's protecting his people," she acknowledged, "as I'm trying to protect mine." Standing Bear had provided them with additional furs and food for the journey. More surprisingly, he had gifted each Sullivan child with a small medicine pouch to wear around their necks, a gesture of spiritual protection that transcended cultural differences. The children's reactions to their impending departure were mixed. William seemed energized by the sense of purpose, eager to be part of the mission to clear the Comanche of false accusations. Emma had grown attached to Little Dove during their brief stay and was reluctant to leave her new friend. James, sensing the tension around him, had become unusually quiet, clinging to his mother's skirts. Singing Grass approached as they prepared to depart, carrying a bundle of dried herbs for Margaret. Through Little Dove's halting translation, she explained these were for healing and protection on their journey. "She says you have strong heart," Little Dove translated, "like Comanche mother." The unexpected compliment brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "Tell her thank you," she said, impulsively embracing the other woman. After a moment of surprise, Singing Grass returned the embrace. Their departure from the camp was observed by most of its inhabitants, some offering gestures of goodwill, others watching with undisguised skepticism. Standing Bear raised his hand in formal farewell, his weathered face unreadable as they rode into the brightening day. Swift Arrow set a brisk pace, aware that time worked against them. The 2-day journey to the traders' camp would take them through varied terrain, some exposed ridges where they might be spotted from a distance, and dense pine forests where ambush could threaten. "The raiders hunt in this territory," he explained grimly. "We must be vigilant." Morning passed without incident, the brilliant winter sun making the snow-covered landscapes sparkle like scattered diamonds. Margaret rode with James in front of her, while Emma and William shared another horse. Swift Arrow led the way, constantly scanning their surroundings, with Running Fox ranging ahead as scout. Grey Wolf and Black Knife brought up the rear, maintaining watchful silence. By midday, they had left the sheltered valley and begun traversing more exposed terrain. Swift Arrow called a brief halt in the shelter of a rock outcropping, where they shared a cold meal of dried buffalo meat and pemmican. "How much farther to Grey Rock?" Margaret asked, watching her children eat with the hearty appetite of youth, seemingly untroubled by the tension evident in their adult companions. "If we maintain this pace, we will reach Grey Rock by tomorrow afternoon," Swift Arrow replied. "Jenkins often stays there for several days when trading with mountain tribes. With luck, he will still be there." "And if he's not?" Margaret couldn't help asking. Swift Arrow's expression remained stoic. "Then we find another way to reach the fort safely." Black Knife said something in Comanche, his tone derisive. Swift Arrow responded sharply, causing the other warrior to fall silent, though his hostile glare toward Margaret intensified. "What did he say?" Margaret asked quietly when Black Knife had moved away to check on the horses. Swift Arrow hesitated, then answered honestly. "He said there is no safe way for Comanche to approach a white fort in these times. That we risk our lives for people who would shoot us on sight." The brutal truth of this assessment hung in the cold air between them. Margaret had no easy rebuttal, knowing that Black Knife's assessment of frontier realities was all too accurate. "I won't let that happen," she said finally. "I'll make them understand." Swift Arrow's expression softened slightly. "You have strong will, Margaret Sullivan. Let us hope it is enough." They resumed their journey, the terrain becoming increasingly rugged as they followed a game trail that wound between rocky outcroppings. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across their path, creating pockets of concealing darkness that set everyone on edge. Running Fox returned from his scouting position at a gallop, his face tense as he reported to Swift Arrow in rapid Comanche. The war chief's expression darkened as he listened. "Riders ahead," he translated for Margaret. "6 men heading this way along the valley floor." "The raiders?" Margaret asked, instinctively gathering her children closer. "Perhaps, or soldiers. Either brings danger." Swift Arrow surveyed their exposed position with concern. "We must seek cover until they pass." He led them quickly off the trail toward a dense stand of pines that offered concealment. They dismounted, leading the horses deep into the trees where branches heavy with snow provided additional screening. "Quiet," Swift Arrow instructed the children, his voice barely above a whisper. "No sound until I say it's safe." They waited in tense silence, the minutes stretching endlessly. Margaret could feel her heart pounding as she held James tightly against her chest, his small body warm despite the cold air. William and Emma pressed close on either side, their young faces solemn with understanding of their danger. The sound of approaching horses reached them first, a rhythmic crunching of hooves through snow, accompanied by male voices carried on. The winter air. Swift Arrow motioned for complete stillness as the riders drew nearer. Through gaps in the pine branches, Margaret caught glimpses of the passing party. 6 men mounted on sturdy horses, rifles prominent across their saddles. Their rough appearance and mismatched clothing marked them as neither military nor typical settlers. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through her as she recognized the man riding in the lead. A tall figure with sandy hair and a distinctive scar bisecting his left cheek. It was him, the leader who had struck her down in her own cabin, who had taken everything they needed to survive the winter. Margaret's hand instinctively went to her mouth to stifle any sound, but it was James who presented the real danger. This child had also recognized the man, his body going rigid with fear in her arms. Margaret could feel him drawing breath to speak or cry out. Quickly, she pressed her hand gently but firmly over his mouth, her eyes pleading with him to remain silent. James's eyes widened, but he gave a tiny nod of understanding. The raiders passed within 30 yards of their hiding place, close enough that Margaret could hear fragments of their conversation. "Told Mason we'd meet him at Crawford's Creek." "Soldiers. All over looking for. Blame it on the Comanche again." Then they were past, continuing down the valley, unaware of the witnesses hidden among the pines. Margaret released her breath slowly, only then realizing she had been holding it. She removed her hand from James's mouth, kissing the top of his. In bed in silent thanks for his bravery, no one moved until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. Swift Arrow was the first to speak, his voice still hushed. "You recognized them." It wasn't a question, but Margaret nodded anyway. "The leader, with the scarred face, he's the one who attacked our homestead, called himself Hardin." Black Knife's expression shifted subtly, the first crack in his hostility as he registered that Margaret's account aligned with what they had just witnessed. "They spoke of meeting someone at Crawford's Creek," Swift Arrow said thoughtfully, "and of blaming Comanche again." Grey Wolf, who had remained silent until now, offered his assessment in Comanche. Swift Arrow translated for Margaret's benefit. "Grey Wolf says they plan another attack, something to further inflame white settlers against Comanche." A terrible understanding dawned on Margaret. "Crawford's Creek, that's where the Henderson family homesteads. They have 5 children." Her voice caught. "The youngest is just a baby." The implication hung in the frozen air between them. If the raiders struck again, staging another fake Comanche attack, the territory would erupt into all-out war. More innocent lives, both settler and Comanche, would be lost. Swift Arrow conferred briefly with his warriors in Comanche. the discussion clearly intense though conducted in low voices. Black Knife seemed to be arguing forcefully for one course of action, while Grey Wolf advocated another. Running Fox remained watchful, dividing his attention between the discussion and their surroundings. Finally, Swift Arrow turned back to Margaret. His decision made, we cannot let them attack another family. We must stop them. But the children? Margaret began, her protective instincts flaring. Grey Wolf will take you and your children to a safe place, Swift Arrow interrupted. A hunting cabin used by my people during summer months. It is not far from here and well hidden, he continued before she could protest. When the raiders are dealt with, I will come for you. Then we continue to Jenkins' camp. Margaret understood the logic of his plan, but everything within her rebelled at the thought of Swift Arrow facing the raiders without aid. These were men who had already killed, without hesitation or mercy. There are 6 of them and only 3 of you, she pointed out. The odds would be worse if we allowed them to reach their companions. Swift Arrow finished for her. We have the advantage of surprise, and justice stands with us. Margaret knew there was no time to argue, not with innocent lives hanging in the balance. Still, she felt compelled to offer what she knew of their adversaries. Hardin favors his right side. An old injury makes him slow to turn left, she told Swift Arrow. The tall one with the red beard is their best shot. The youngest one, barely more than a boy, hesitates before firing. Swift Arrow's eyes registered surprise at this tactical assessment, followed quickly by respect. You observed well for someone facing death. I was protecting my children, Margaret said simply. I noticed anything that might help us survive. A ghost of a smile touched Swift Arrow's lips, like a Comanche mother indeed. The decision made, they moved quickly to implement their plan. Grey Wolf would lead Margaret and her children to the hunting cabin, while Swift Arrow, Black Knife, and Running Fox pursued the raiders, hoping to intercept them before they reached Crawford's Creek. As they prepared to separate, Margaret impulsively caught Swift Arrow's arm. Be careful, she said, the words inadequate for the concern she felt. These men have nothing to lose. Swift Arrow covered her hand briefly with his own. I will return, he promised. Wait for me. The simple exchange, witnessed by all present, seemed to shift something fundamental in Black Knife's perception. His hostile glare softened marginally as he nodded once to Margaret before mounting his horse. As Grey Wolf led them away, Margaret couldn't help looking back to watch Swift Arrow and his companions disappear into the gathering dusk, riding swiftly. Toward a confrontation, she could only pray they would survive. The hunting cabin proved to be little more than a rough shelter. A single room built of logs with a dirt floor and no windows. Still, its stone fireplace and solid walls offered protection from the elements, and Grey Wolf quickly had a small fire burning to ward off the evening chill. The children, exhausted by the day's events and tension, fell asleep almost immediately, huddled together under buffalo robes. Margaret envied their ability to surrender to exhaustion despite the uncertainty surrounding them. Grey Wolf positioned himself near the cabin's entrance, his rifle across his knees as he maintained his vigilant watch. Though they shared no common language, Margaret felt oddly comforted by his calm presence. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Margaret alternated between dozing fitfully and staring into the fire, her mind conjuring terrible scenarios of what might be happening at Crawford's Creek. Outside, the wind had risen, driving snow against the cabin's walls with a sound like distant whispers. It was well past midnight when Grey Wolf suddenly tensed, his head turning toward the door. Margaret was instantly alert, reaching for her children even as she strained to hear what had caught the warrior's attention. A soft scratching at the door was followed by Swift Arrow's voice, speaking in Comanche. Grey Wolf responded visible, relief in his posture as he moved to open the door. Swift Arrow entered alone, snow dusting his shoulders and hair. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes found Margaret's immediately. "The Hendersons are safe," he said without preamble. "The raiders will not trouble anyone again." Margaret absorbed this news, reading between the sparse words to the conflict that must have occurred, and Black Knife running fox. "They returned to the winter camp to warn our people," Swift Arrow replied, accepting a cup of water from Grey Wolf. "The threat is ended, but there may be others who think as these men did." He settled beside the fire, the weight of the day's events evident in the careful way he moved. Margaret noticed a dark stain on his sleeve that could only be blood. "You're hurt," she said, moving to examine the wound. Swift Arrow shook his head dismissively. "A scratch only. It will heal." Despite his protest, Margaret insisted on cleaning the deep cut that ran along his forearm. Using water warmed by the fire and strips torn from her petticoat, she worked in silence, aware of Grey Wolf watching with unreadable eyes. "You fought for my people today," she said finally, securing the makeshift bandage. "For the Hendersons who never knew the danger that threatened them. I don't know how to thank you." Swift Arrow's gaze was steady. "I fought for justice, Margaret Sullivan, as you do by seeking truth rather than vengeance." His words carried a weight beyond their simple meaning, acknowledgement that they had each transcended the expected limitations of their backgrounds to find common purpose. Outside, the wind gradually subsided, leaving an expectant hush over the frozen landscape. Within the cabin's sheltering walls, Settler and Comanche rested together, united by shared danger and mutual respect that would have seemed impossible mere days before. Dawn would bring new challenges as they resumed their journey to find Samuel Jenkins. But for now, in the firelit darkness, they had achieved a fragile peace, a glimpse of what might be possible if others could look beyond the barriers of prejudice and history that divided their peoples. They departed the hunting cabin. At first light, traveling swiftly through a landscape transformed by fresh snowfall. Swift Arrow pushed their pace, knowing that despite eliminating the immediate threat, the larger danger of misunderstanding and retaliation remained. "Jenkins often camps at Grey Rock for only 3 or 4 days, he explained as they rode. "If he has already departed, our task becomes much harder." The children, sensing the urgency, maintained unusual silence as they traveled. Even James, normally full of questions, seemed to understand the gravity of their mission. William rode beside Grey Wolf, observing the warrior's tracking techniques with keen interest. Emma kept close to Margaret, occasionally reaching over to touch her mother's hand, as if reassuring herself of her presence. By midday, the terrain began to change, descending into a river valley where bare cottonwoods lined the frozen watercourse. Swift Arrow reined in at the crest of a ridge, pointing to a plume of smoke rising from a bend in the river about a mile ahead. "Jenkins' camp," he confirmed after studying the location through narrowed eyes. "And his wagon is still there." Relief washed over Margaret. The first critical piece of their plan had fallen into place. Now came the more complicated task of convincing Jenkins to help them reach Fort Collins with their story about the raiders. As they approached the camp, Swift Arrow and Grey Wolf became increasingly alert, scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. When they were within half a mile, Swift Arrow halted their party in a sheltered grove. "I will approach first," he decided. "Jenkins knows me, but in these troubled times, a group of riders might make him nervous." Margaret nodded, understanding the wisdom of this caution. "We'll wait here until you signal it's safe." Swift Arrow rode ahead alone, following the river's course toward the trader's camp. Margaret watched his tall figure grow smaller with distance, an unexpected tightness in her chest at the thought of what awaited them at the journey's end. 20 anxious minutes later, Swift Arrow reappeared on the ridge above them, waving his arm in a signal to approach. Margaret exhaled in relief, helping the children remount before following Grey Wolf up the slope toward the trader's camp. Samuel Jenkins proved to be a weathered man in his 50s, with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that softened when he saw the Sullivan children. His camp was well organized around a large canvas-covered wagon painted with the words Jenkins Trading Co. in faded letters. "Swift Arrow tells me you've had quite an ordeal, Mrs. Sullivan," Jenkins said after introductions were made, "and that you have information about these attacks that have everyone from here to Denver in an uproar." Margaret nodded, accepting the cup of coffee he offered with gratitude. "I saw the men who did it, the same ones who attacked my family and left us to die, also killed the Comanche hunters and the Blackwoods at the trading post." Jenkins listened intently as Margaret recounted the entire story: the raid on her homestead, Swift Arrow's rescue, their journey to the Comanche camp, and finally the confrontation with Hardin's gang. "That matches what I've been hearing," Jenkins confirmed when she had finished. "These staged attacks have a purpose beyond simple robbery. Someone wants the Comanche pushed out or wiped out to clear the way for something else. Gold, Swift Arrow suggested, or the railroad. Always, there is something valuable beneath our feet that makes white men forget their own laws." Jenkins didn't disagree. "The question is, will anyone at Fort Collins believe your account? The territorial governors already issued an ultimatum to all Comanche bands to surrender or face military action." Margaret's heart sank. "But that's exactly what these raiders wanted, to provoke conflict between settlers and Comanche. You have proof?" Jenkins asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Only my word," Margaret admitted. "And these." She withdrew Daniel's Bible, opening it to reveal several folded pages tucked inside the cover. "My husband kept accounts of everyone who visited our homestead. The day before the attack, 2 men stopped asking for directions, gave their names as Hardin and Meeks. Daniel wrote it down, along with a description of the scarred man. Jenkins examined the journal entries with interest. This helps, not conclusive, but it supports your story. There's also this," Margaret added, pulling a silver watch fob from her pocket. "I took it from one of the raiders when they were stopped at Crawford's Creek. It has my husband's initials engraved on it. D.S. Daniel gave it to me when William was born. The raiders stole it during the attack on our home." This physical evidence visibly impressed Jenkins. "That's something tangible the authorities can't easily dismiss, combined with your testimony and these journal entries." He glanced at Swift Arrow, who had remained standing throughout their conversation, his posture alert as always. "The difficulty is getting Mrs. Sullivan and her children safely to Fort Collins without you being spotted. If Comanche warriors are seen approaching the fort now, soldiers will shoot first and ask questions never." "That is why we sought you," Swift Arrow acknowledged. "You can take them the final distance." Jenkins nodded slowly. "I can. My wagon leaves for Fort Collins tomorrow morning. I have business with the quartermaster there delivering supplies. Mrs. Sullivan and her children can ride with me." Margaret felt simultaneous relief and apprehension. The plan was working, yet the moment of separation from Swift Arrow approached, more rapidly than she had anticipated. "What about you?" she asked him. "What will you do?" "Return to my people," Swift Arrow replied simply. "The winter grows harsh. They will need every hunter." His matter-of-fact response masked the danger he would face, traveling alone through territory increasingly hostile to any Comanche presence. That evening, as the children slept in the warmth of Jenkins' wagon, Margaret found Swift Arrow standing, alone at the edge of the camp, gazing toward the distant mountains, now gilded with moonlight. "I never properly thanked you," she said, moving to stand beside him, "for saving us, for everything since." Swift Arrow continued looking toward the mountains. "No thanks are needed for doing what is right. Still, I owe you more than I can ever repay," Margaret persisted. "My children's lives, my own." He turned to her then, his expression softening in the moonlight. Perhaps one day when your children tell this story to their children, they will remember that not all Comanche were enemies, that some were friends. That would be payment enough." The simple request touched Margaret deeply. In a world determined to see only differences between their peoples, Swift Arrow asked only for truth to be remembered. "They'll remember," she promised. "William already looks up to you more than you know. Last night he told me he wants to be honorable like you when he becomes a man." A rare smile crossed Swift Arrow's face. The boy has good instincts. He protected his sisters like a warrior twice his age. They stood in companionable silence, watching stars emerge in the winter sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Margaret faced the authorities at Fort Collins, attempting to prevent a war based on lies. Yet in this moment, she felt an unexpected peace. "What will you do after?" Swift Arrow asked finally. "If your testimony is believed, where will you and your children go?" The question had weighed on Margaret since leaving their cabin. Their homestead was lost, Daniel was gone, and the frontier that had once represented hope now seemed haunted by tragedy. "I don't know," she admitted. "Perhaps back east to Cincinnati, where I have a cousin, or to Denver, where I might find work." As a midwife, neither option appealed to her, though she didn't say so aloud. Cincinnati represented a past she had willingly left behind, while Denver's growing bustle felt wrong for children raised in the open spaces of the territory. "There is another possibility," Swift Arrow said carefully. "When spring comes, my people will leave the winter camp. Some will go to the reservation as the government demands. Others will travel north to join relatives among the northern Cheyenne." He paused, choosing his next words with deliberation. "My sister Singing Grass spoke of you before we left. She said her tipi has room for a woman who knows healing plants, and has children who bring laughter." Margaret stared at him, scarcely believing what he seemed to be suggesting. "You mean stay with your people? Would that even be possible?" "It has happened before," Swift Arrow acknowledged. "Not often, but there are stories of white women who chose our ways after losing everything to war or sickness. Some found new lives among the people." The unexpected possibility unfolded in Margaret's mind, not an immediate decision, but a door opening to a future she hadn't considered. "Your council would allow this?" she asked, still stunned by the suggestion. Standing. "Bear values healing knowledge," Swift Arrow replied, "and Little Dove has already claimed Emma as her sister." Even Black Knife's anger softened when he saw you recognize the raiders. He turned to face her directly. "I do not ask for your answer now. Go to Fort Collins. Tell your truth. When that task is complete, if you wish to consider this path, send word through Jenkins. He knows how to find us." The offer hung between them, neither a declaration nor a simple kindness, but something more complex, a recognition perhaps that their worlds had already irrevocably intersected, that boundaries once thought impermeable had proven otherwise. Dawn arrived with a clear sky that promised fair weather for traveling. Jenkins had his wagon prepared, early, supplies packed efficiently for the journey to Fort Collins. Margaret and her children said their goodbyes to Grey Wolf, who would accompany Swift Arrow partway back to the Comanche camp before breaking off to warn other bands about the situation with the settlers. When it came time for Swift Arrow's farewell, the children surprised both adults with their responses. William approached the war chief with solemn dignity, extending his hand as he had seen his father do when making important agreements. "Thank you for saving my family," the boy said, his young voice steady. "I won't forget what you taught me." Swift Arrow clasped William's hand, warrior to warrior. "Remember to look for tracks where others see only snow," he replied, referencing one of the hunting lessons he had shared. "And protect your sisters always." Emma, typically shy, impulsively hugged Swift Arrow around the waist. "Will we see you again?" she asked, her voice muffled against his buckskin shirt. The question carried more weight than the child could know. Swift Arrow rested his hand briefly on her blonde head. "The path ahead has many turns, little one. We cannot see where it leads until we walk it." Even James offered his own goodbye, solemnly presenting Swift Arrow with a small carved wooden horse that Daniel had made for him. "For remembering us," the 5-year-old explained. Swift Arrow accepted the gift with appropriate gravity, tucking it carefully into his medicine pouch. "I will keep it close," he promised. Finally, he turned to Margaret. Words suddenly seemed inadequate for all that had passed between them. The journey from fear to trust, from suspicion to respect, from strangers to something without easy definition. "Goodbye, Swift Arrow," she said simply, extending her hand. He took it in both of his touch warm despite the morning chill. "Until our paths cross again, Margaret Sullivan." The use of until rather than if lingered in Margaret's mind, as she watched him mount his horse and ride away, his straight-backed silhouette gradually receding into the distance, until he disappeared over a ridge as suddenly as he had appeared at her cabin door that fateful day. "Remarkable man," Jenkins commented as he helped Margaret and her children onto the wagon seat, "one of the few who still believes peace is possible between our peoples." "Do you think it is?" Margaret asked, gathering James onto her lap as Jenkins took up the reins. The trader considered the question with the weightiness it deserved. "Peace requires truth," he said finally, "and people willing to speak it even when others don't want to hear." He glanced at her with newfound respect. "People, like you, Mrs. Sullivan." The wagon lurched forward, beginning the final leg of their journey to Fort Collins. As they followed the river valley southward, Margaret found her thoughts divided between the immediate challenge awaiting her at the fort and Swift Arrow's unexpected suggestion of a different future. Cincinnati or Denver had seemed her only options. Just days ago, now another possibility had emerged, unconventional, likely fraught with challenges, yet strangely compelling. A path that neither denied what had happened nor allowed tragedy to dictate her family's future. "Ma, look!" William's excited voice broke into her thoughts. He pointed to a high ridge where a solitary figure on horseback was silhouetted against the morning sky. Margaret shaded her eyes, recognizing instantly the proud posture and distinctive headdress of the Comanche war chief. Swift Arrow raised, his hand in a final farewell gesture before turning his horse and disappearing over the ridge. "He's making sure we get safely away," Jenkins explained, a note of approval in his voice. "Will we ever see him again, Ma?" Emma asked, echoing her earlier question to Swift Arrow himself. Margaret considered her daughter's question, remembering Swift Arrow's response about the path ahead having many turns. The truth was, she didn't know what awaited them at Fort Collins or beyond. The frontier had already proven itself both more brutal and more surprising than she had ever anticipated. But as the wagon continued south toward Fort Collins and whatever future awaited them there, Margaret Sullivan felt something she had thought. Lost forever in that ransacked cabin, hope, fragile but persistent, like the first green shoot emerging from winter snow. "The path has many turns," she echoed, drawing her children close. "We'll follow it together and see where it leads." Behind them, the mountains rose majestic against the winter sky, their snow-covered peaks catching the morning sunlight. Somewhere, amid those ancient heights, the Comanche winter camp awaited the return of its war chief, the man who had risked everything to save a widow and her 3 children, changing all their lives in ways none could have imagined. And as the wagon rolled onward toward Fort Collins, Margaret realized that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever decisions waited to be made, her family had already received the most precious gift possible. A second chance at life, delivered by the most unlikely of saviors. The bitter Colorado. Winter of 1876 had shown no mercy to anyone, But it had also revealed that even in the harshest circumstances, humanity could transcend the artificial boundaries of race and history. That lesson, more than any other, would shape whatever future the Sullivan family chose to embrace. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.